Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 21 of The Only Way is Ethics. Thank you everyone for joining us and for listening. As you probably know, but if you don't, you can find us on Spotify and YouTube. So I'd like to welcome Paul Llewelyn, who has joined us for today's episode. Paul, hi, and thank you ever so much for taking the time to do this episode with us. As people may or may not know, I'll let Paul introduce himself, but myself and Paul sit on the Clinical Safety Leadership Committee at BCS, and we've known each other for a few years now. So, Paul, I'll hand over to you just to give us a bit about your background as a clinician and your journey into digital health. And then I know we've got some great topics that we want to discuss. So I'll hand over to you.
So thanks, Dean. Thanks for inviting me on your podcast. Hello, everyone. So my background, I'm a registered nurse. It's a whole story how I got into nursing. I didn't grow up wanting to be a nurse. I went to college and I guess was a bit disillusioned, a little bit lost about what I wanted to do. My mother, a conversation in the kitchen, have you thought about nursing? She's a lifer. She was a nurse for over 40 years.
Wow.
And of course, it was something I'd never considered. Certainly after hearing some of the stories from her 2 nights a week on A&E unit. And my brother was a paramedic, and several of my mother's sisters were also nurses, and a number of their kids were nurses, and so on. In fact, I once sat down with my uncle, and we worked out the number of years that the family had, not just my immediate family, but extended family had worked for in the NHS, and nursing-wise alone was touching 400 years.
Wow.
So I'm sure that must be a record. But I went to the library and looked at some prospectuses, and I fancied doing a nursing degree and realised what I needed for that. So that gave me a bit of a goal to achieve, to get into uni to study nursing, which was a 4-year degree, and I started that in 92 and finished in 96. And my first ward was at Guy's and St Thomas's in London, and I quickly realised that I didn't really want to do night shifts, and I was also getting married a few months into qualifying, and I we had ideas to start a family, and so I took the opportunity to move into an opportunity came up for a colleague I had studied with to work in the community. So after a few months at Guy's, sorry guys, I didn't stay much longer. I moved into the community as a community staff nurse. And this was the old system. Was it DEF? The old grading system. And I worked at Enfield, in the Enfield Community Care NHS Trust, I think it was at the time. And I stayed there a year, and then you progress through the ranks. And nursing has never been a highly paid profession, so I want to support my family. I wanted to progress quickly, so I did progress quite quickly, getting to charge nurse or charge nurse equivalent, which was district nurse, within about 4 years. And then district nursing in itself, as you know, is a specialty, and primarily elderly care, not solely, but comorbidity care, long-term conditions, and so on. So I worked in Howard Hill and healthcare, and thoroughly enjoyed that. But one of the frustrations, as I've heard from many clinicians on your podcast and far beyond, was the lack of digital. So this was back in between 96 and 2006, that 10 years full-time NHS that I was working in the community, probably more pronounced in the community because you're on the move. And you might recall community nurses, and I'm sure those that are listening, the diary, the paper diary. I'm sure not so now, but perhaps in some pockets, where you would keep your list of patients and your visit list and what you were going for, and the notes were held in the home, and you just hope that they were of good quality, because that's what you'd be referring to administer care. And that was always a bit of a frustration, and also a risk in many respects, which we'll get onto later. So I always had an interest in digital. I wouldn't describe myself as a geek in that sense, but more in the practical application of digital. I was quite how can I put it, guarded initially. In fact, my dissertation, my first degree, was to do with the dehumanization aspects of technology, primarily around the high-tech wards such as ITU and CCU, and so it was more my fear that even back then that technology could, whereas obviously provide life-saving treatment, might also cause risk and harm, and lead to disengagement with patients. And then towards the late 90s, early noughties, I was just desperate. We only had an admin system within the organization, and it was primarily for outcome, primarily to we want to be paid. You put in you was Kerner, what do they call them, Kerner cards, which were then transferred, an e-version of that. And it was primarily payments driven, and not much to do at all with patients. But obviously I understood the importance of that. So my first venture, I'm sorry, it's really boring. It was Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word. And a good example, this was around 2000, early noughties, that time. And I just thought, I keep writing these care plans. And whether it's a grade 4 pressure ulcer, or Hickman line flush, or, diabetes, insulin administration, whatever, the actual fundamental components, as well, of the care plan were very repetitive.
Consistent,
and it obviously should be based off best practice. That's why we have the Royal Marsden Guide with all the procedures in there, clinical procedures. So I thought, rather than writing this care plan out time and time again, why don't I just replicate the paper version we've got in Word, and then I can populate 80% of it, and then we'll leave the 20% for that personalization. If it's John I'm seeing, then I can personalize it to John. And so that was it. But of course, when it came to printing that and doing a few photocopies and trying to encourage other people to look at my care plans, would you like some? It was quite a bit of resistance, actually. Even something as simple as that. It was that would sort of depersonalize the care process, and I prefer to write my own. And my argument was, well, look, this could save you time, and it's based on best practice. Why would you not want to use them, and so on? But I quickly realized that it wasn't an argument I wanted to have, and it wasn't something that I desperately wanted to push, because I think that the best change and the best uptake of practices like this are through actually showcasing and sort of leading by example, as it were. And so I simply just partitioned the filing cabinet, divvied out these care plans in the filing cabinet, and then invited others if they wanted to use them. 3 weeks later, they were all using them, and because they realized how much time saving, and then of course using that time for anything from training to actually spending more time with patients. I also had you might remember the Scion Palm pilots. It was I can't remember what series I had. I think it was 5 or 6, whatever. And again, that was back in the early noughties. It was really unusual to have one of those. Can't remember where I got it. It was definitely secondhand, that's for sure. And I would use that for like to-do lists and so on. funny enough, I was speaking a few months ago to Justin Watland, and he also had one of these Palm Pilots. So perhaps there are many people listening to this podcast that also were desperate to break into digital. You will remember.
Yeah.
Can't remember exactly what I used it for, but it was quite handy. But and then that progressed around 2005. So I'd worked up in management and still clinical patient facing. And I secured a position on the Professional Executive Committee, which you might recall. So the PEC committee was an exec committee of the board, and we would advise on clinical matters. And it would have representation from a few GPs, a pharmacist, HPs, and a couple of nurses, and so on. And it was a role that you had to be interviewed for, and I was a little bit apprehensive about going for it. I would be representing 300 nurses in the trust, along with one other nurse, but I thought, I real strong emphasis on development, so that's I thought I'd be daft not to. And coincidentally, a few months before, and I didn't even know this position was coming up, I invited the CEO out with me, which I think I was the first nurse ever to invite the CEO on the road. All the nurses were, we all had our gripes and so on, and I was like, let's just invite, because Andrew Morton at the time was the CEO down in Havana. Let's just invite him out. And he emailed his secretary, and she got back and said, hey, yeah, he'd love to come out, and he did. It was great.
Brilliant.
It was So the reason I dropped that is because then when I went for this position, it came up, and Andrew actually ended up interviewing me. But he sort of had a bit of insight into the real me, which we'd hopefully left a good impression. So I was successful in securing that role. But this role, an aspect of this role, once I bedded in, was as transformation lead, and we were procuring a new EPR, RIO, which is a community mental health and child health solution.
Right, well.
And this was part of the national programme, national programme for IT, which I'm sure most people listening to are more than familiar with. And I was part of my remit was taken on this transformation role, this transformation leadership role. So that I just got the bug. I really enjoyed it, and I am a people person. I'm pragmatic, and I felt that I would like this, and I had dedicated time. I still enjoyed, obviously, the patient care, but it was fantastic. Really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it so much that after several months in that role, I jumped to the dark side, as it were. I went contracting, and I went to work for BT. So we're now in July 2006, and I secured a role which I was fortunate enough to get. I went for another role before that. Actually, I did go for a transformation lead role with BT. I didn't get it, but rather than think, well, that position was mine, I deserved it, that it's their loss, and so on. I plugged away, and thankfully it paid off, because they got back in touch, said, we've got this product specialist role, would you be interested in that? So I jumped at that. And it's important to mention, it was a real tear, because I really enjoyed the patient patient contact, and it was always going to just be I'll give this a couple of years and I'll be back, and it here I am, almost 20 years later in digital health. But that's been going through it's been quite a journey. In BT, in the national programme for IT, afforded that to me, and I really developed with that digital mindset. So starting off as a product specialist, my first day on the job, I was told to write an RBAC guide for clinicians, and it's wow, talk about baptism by fire. And And I thought, well, you know, and it wasn't. It's like when you're thrown into these roles, there's no, you know, there's no necessarily guide to walk you
There's
through
no
it.
guidebook.
And everybody's
no
busy, and there was
instructions
lots of other contractors.
what to
Everybody's
do.
doing their thing, but
Yeah.
I embraced it, and I thought that, well, look, this is the way it's going to be, and I've got I am focused, and so I thought, look, let's do it, and afterwards I said, oh, well, you know, I hope this is good enough. It's a bit simplistic, to be honest, but hopefully that's why we got you to do it. We didn't want it pitched at a highly technical level, and we knew that with you just coming in. So progressed on, did EPR implementation for 8 years. So that was design, you know, going through all, you know, attending the supplier CSE Serverlec at the time, attending the design workshops, FAT testing, factory acceptance testing before the release was released to BT for further testing, you know, approving the designs, and so on and so on. So it taught me the whole software development life cycle, and we went through various releases. I think the earliest release I worked on was version 4, right through to release 2, which was the final version. And we all took responsibility for a specific module. So I was the prescribing expert, as it were. You know, you need a focus. I also work quite a bit on SNOMED, and various other things. And we had other experts in order comms. I'm guarded when I say expert because I never quite feel an expert. If things move so fast, but let's just say I knew quite a lot about those areas that I focused on. And I wasn't a CSO at the time. We had a dedicated clinical safety team led by initially Martin Ellis, who is now, I believe, CDIO down in Croydon, I think, and Adrian Stavitt-Dobson subsequent to that. And Adrian, of course, now is he's the owner of Safeland. And both of them did a great job. And, you know, we had a very robust clinical risk management system. Oh, I nearly forgot. I must give a shout out to Clive Thompson as well, because in fact Clive then ended up at Accenture and subsequent to that Cerner. But Clive was also headed up as well at BT for a period. They all did a great job, and we had a really robust clinical risk management system there, and it you know, very impressive. But I wasn't in that team, but I interfaced with that team a lot, and so I certainly understood the process. And as a nurse, and obviously not exclusive just to nurses, but as a healthcare professional, I knew about risk management, not necessarily in a rigid, following a rigid methodology, but almost through instinct and it's you know, that experience and of course some rudimentary training. Exactly. So I gained a lot of insight during those years as part of my EPR work. And then after the National Programme for IT, you know, when it was winding down and I came off that release 2 in November 2013, I was asked to pick up a role as the BT National Clinical Lead for telehealth operation that we had. So as part of a outsourcing deal, we procured a national telehealth telecare operation down in Cornwall, which at the time was the largest in the UK, I believe. About 1,200 telehealth patients and about 10,000 telecare users. And we were looking to grow that service beyond Cornwall. And I was part of that outfit, and I worked in that team for a couple of years. We had some success, but I think in many respects we were before our time. You know, it's you know, everybody's talking, you know, wearables, telehealth now, but back then, not really. It was a real challenge to get not so much interest. I think there was interest. It was more the funding models didn't support, and the you know, that 5-year funding plan and having that beyond the pilot.
I think a lot of these these projects and sort of like, it's getting it wasn't necessarily the buy-in, because people were very like infused, but it was just the resourcing and the support in relation to getting these deployed and implemented. And I'm just going to sort of like, it's really interesting, Paul, listening to your journey, and we will pick up on how you sort of moved on further. But it's great listening to you and hearing that whole piece about the evolution of your journey, because it started from, and I was in a similar sort of, and I think there's lots of us out there that sort of are probably sort of like are listening, that have been on similar journeys with a lot of like similarities, like, so almost fell into digital health in a way, in relation to, you were using this initiative, which is Microsoft Word, which is at the start of that evolutionary sort of like journey, isn't it, in relation to how can I make my service more efficient, and what I'm doing, and in freeing up time to support sort of like patients and other activities, and then moving on to sort of like, the Palm Pilot and doing that. And then all of a sudden you're on this journey, aren't you, that's taken you into sort of like the opportunities to then sort of like, join BT and really get your teeth into sort of like the projects.
We were even having discussions, Dean, at the time around taking printers out with us in the community, and this wasn't my, the heat printers, which I think one of the smallest printers you can get, was just a tiny little printer, but it almost give like to be honest, not much more than a bus ticket. So I'm not sure if they give bus tickets now, but it didn't. Thankfully, I don't think that idea took off. But yeah, it's I think once you feel you're making a difference and you're driving that digital agenda, it's very difficult to back off, which is why I'm here all these years later. I until not too long ago did bank work, so it was almost like my fix, keeping that patient contact.
Absolutely.
And I do hope to get back to it soon. It does give me a reality check in what I do.
But I think that digital journey and like sort of, listening to you talking about sort of like those experiences, and sort of like, and being part of a team that, and some sort of like some names that we know now are sort of like still within digital health, are quite prominent within digital health as well. There's still quite a few of us around that have been around since the national programme for IT. I think it's really good to see that there are sort of like, there's new blood coming through as well, with different perspectives in relation to that. But I think it's really, for me, it's really key seeing that sort of like, one of the topic areas that sort of like, talking about is that nurse's perspective in relation to technology and development. That you've just told it firsthand in relation to sort of like, utilising and applying your sort of like, those clinical skills and your experience to say, well, how can we apply this to sort of like, what we're doing and what we've got available to us at the time. And interestingly, you talking about sort of like that whole telehealth sort of like, because it's just alien to people, isn't it? And I remember sort of like bringing in and trying to move forward in respect to transformation. So I was part of an interestingly very similar timeline. So I trained from 92 to 95. I left the NHS full time in 2006. And joined IMS Maxims, an EPR supplier. But when you're trying to promote that electronic patient record to someone, and you're trying to sort of, and people are saying to you, what is this? How is it going to help me? And I think what we didn't necessarily do that well back then was that whole benefits realization and that business change and the change management side of things. I think back in the national programme for IT, a lot of things were sort of almost pushed on people, weren't they? It was like, this is coming in and you will use it in that sort of respect. And I think then you get that sort of, don't you get that pushback. And I think we're still feeling some of that, however many years down the line. I think sort of like when certain systems come in and people have these incumbent EPRs that have been around in certain trusts for many, many years, and then they're used to that, that they've been implemented in a certain fashion, and then all of a sudden we've come a very long way, haven't we? I mean, comparing where we were in 2006 to like sort of now, you're talking sort of like, you know, sort of 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's certainly been a long journey, and we still have NHS trusts without an EPR. Of course, there's a deadline to fix that, but I never envisaged when I was deploying way back that we would be in this situation now. And as for interoperability, it's again, that's a whole different whole different ball game. But going back to what you were saying about clinician involvement, I mean, perhaps I was just fortunate when I worked on the national program, but we did have a number of workshops, and I facilitated those at the time with the NHS leadership team, and we did have good engagement. In fact, the reason why I ended up in digital health full time and working for BT, which as you know, they were the LSP for London and subsequent the Southern England when Fujitsu pulled out, was because I went to one of those. I think it was a hospice form that we were configuring that day. There's a whole load of sort of end of life forms that we were configuring, and I thought, I'm going to stay behind and I'm going to ask if there's any positions. So I was like waiting for everybody to leave the room before I pounced. I didn't want to give anybody else the idea, and that's how that discussion started. So I ended up being sat in the room, contributing, and later on facilitating. But to be fair, I thought certainly the program, I mean, the national program is vast, but the bit that I was working on, I thought wasn't too bad. I mean, there were restrictions at the time. The software, the configuration. I know that the real product has progressed massively since all those years. 12 years since I've had any interaction with it, and configuration now is often in the control of organizations themselves, whereas at the time it had to go through a whole convoluted process to configure something.
Control process.
So it's a lot more agile now. So and certainly the reports I get back is people like it. But of course, whatever EPR, there's always going to be shortcomings. And one of their main criticisms, certainly with respect to the big EPRs within the acute setting, and they're highly complex and can be difficult to navigate. And this isn't just something that we face in the UK, but many reports elsewhere, and certainly in the US with before EPRs even took off here. But there are technologies emerging such as ambient voice, EPR Copilot to assist in that navigation of the care record and finding information within that care record to be able to use, quickly and efficiently to deliver care. And I think if you can take that burden away from clinicians, then you will also get great optimization, because optimization is another big talking point that often, the transformation, that money runs out at the point of getting it, when you put the last release in, the last major release, and then it's very difficult because people are, clinicians are very overstretched as it is, and you're just using perhaps a bit more than basic functionality to just to enable you to get through your job, and then a lot of the other stuff doesn't get trained out, doesn't get optimized, and as you know, you can't, even if you are really interested in exploring one particular area that isn't yet turned on, if you don't have the buy-in from the team or the service, you can't use it in isolation. That's just not going to work. So it's it is a challenge. There's so much yet to address, and as I mentioned with the interoperability discussion earlier, it's still I mean, after I left the working on telehealth, I ended up working on a interoperability solution where we were designing an integrated digital care portal and a patient portal. And although we got to technical go live, it never went to actual, never got into the hands of patients or clinicians, primarily because of changing policy at national level. But it certainly, if nothing else, it enabled me to develop in those areas. And looking at some of the messaging standards and some of those dependencies to enable interoperability, such as the ITK toolkit, HL7 version 2, all the mapping that is required for all the different widgets, and what do you do with unstructured text and all those challenges. And so developed a lot in those areas. And then I did a course in FIRE to enable me to consolidate some of that learning. Challenge you've got, of course, in this space, in digital health, unless you're using a lot of this stuff on a fairly regular basis, it's quite difficult to retain that knowledge. And AI and machine learning and robotic process automation and ambient voice and telehealth and telecare, and I could go on and on. It's each of these, it's a whole area of subject matter expertise in its own right, and that's not going into the interoperability dependencies and PRSB headings, and now you've got all the other the DICOM standards and everything. So it is challenging to keep up to speed, but at Accenture, where I am, I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier, can't recall. I work as the Chief Clinical Information Officer and Safety and Regulatory Lead. We do place a great emphasis on learning. It is very much a learning organisation, and that's what I like about it. I like learning. I love learning new information, especially from people as opposed to books. But and I do most of mine on the treadmill, just showing off now. It's so I tend to, if I've got a presentation on this specific topic in a couple of weeks, I'll swap on that. It'll all come back. So I just to to those that are listening, don't beat yourself up about not being an expert on all this stuff, because you will struggle. You will struggle. I think for me as a clinician, you need to be able to have the conversation. At Accenture, we've got tons of people that have deep technical knowledge. I don't need to be one of them. They actually need me to have the conversation. So Absolutely. I need to be able to, and that is the fundamental role of the CCIO, being able to act as interpreter to translate that technology, that innovation, how we can apply that. And of course, I need to have an understanding of some of the AWS components and the Azure components, because some of the big programs I work on, those technologies underpin those programs. I don't need to be, a technical expert. So if I'm talking about multi-factor authentication, that is a control. And I need to understand what it does and the failure modes and so on. But that's about it.
I think we're getting into the realms of clinical risk management now, and sort of like, in around that, which is great, absolutely fantastic. But I want to come back to that interoperability piece, and you're saying about sort of like, your experience and working that. But I think we have come far with sort of like FIRE, HL7, like you said, the interoperability toolkit. It has now changed. We've got IAM1, haven't we, and sort of like and all of that. But do you feel, well, I know I feel, and sort of my opinion in relation to where we should be with interoperability between systems, and I know it's a tough job, I'm not saying it isn't, and there is a big ask, isn't there, in relation to, there are hundreds of systems out there that have useful patient sort of like information and data in relation to our personal health records, and for the sharing between sort of health organisations and etc. I feel we should be further along than we are at the moment, because I can pick up in one instance, I've got my chart from Epic, and I've got a plethora of information in there. I've got everything in relation to my care at King's College, whereas I can pick up the app that my GP supports, and it's got nothing in it. I'm just about getting sort of like test results now, but I don't have any.
I haven't tested results for ages.
And yeah, no, this is it. This is it, Paul. Can you see like the sort of like the landscape is so varied in relation to where we are as a nation, and we need to, we need to align. I know there's work in place, and there's, and government initiatives, etc., and stuff like that around. We need to be at this point, but do you think potentially we're losing sight of certain priorities in relation to, yes, there is a goal for and a concentrating on acute and EPRs, and everyone having an EPR by 2026 March, is it, in relation to that? However, should we not get sort of like, there's big issues with primary care at the moment, and that whole social care. I mean, we could spend all day talking about digitising social care and that whole piece. And as I think we know, in relation to what we do in the realms of sort of like clinical risk management and raising awareness, there is a lack of knowledge within primary and social care as opposed to secondary care in relation to health organisations. That's fact. We just know that. It is improving in relation to that, but that's just a historical. And sort of taking that into account, and also the sort of, I think, the legacy of systems within primary and social care as opposed to acute, which I think is improving at a faster. They're more mature in relation to what they do. What are your views in relation to sort of like that? And I suppose I'm posing a question and putting it out there, putting you on the spot. Are we skewed slightly in relation to our priorities, or should they all be moving at the same pace?
So I worked on the interop. I worked as the clinical lead for that back in 2015. So 10 years ago.
Yeah, 10 years ago. Yeah.
So that was for, it wasn't just, we had an in-flight piece of work with one of the clinical commissioning groups in London, but there was lots of other work going on in that area. Same sort of thing as telehealth, when it comes to actually, the hard sell. But there's a lot of practical considerations as well. So we all know that interop, it is a good thing, of course, and we want to be able to share information readily so we can act on it at the point of care, regardless of where we are. But the reality is there's a lot of those source applications have got data which is, data that's missing, it's incorrect, dirty data, call it what you want. And, if you're pulling, well, again, this is part of the consideration when you undertake your clinical safety assessment. You've got to be very guarded about pulling data into a portal that is not, reliable, valid. That was a big piece of work, and we didn't overcome it. So some of those widgets that we had would remain empty because at the time, from memory, I think there were 13 providers that would send their data to the portal. That's a lot of work. You've got to work with 13 different source applications, all the complexity, all of the clinicians and social care practitioners within. And, forget all of the nice stuff. It's just, data in the source applications. And then trying to cleanse that it's just a massive piece of work, a massive undertaking. And of course, that piece of work is undertaken by the local organisation, not by us, not by the supplier, by the local organisation. They have the clinical experts to decipher and to rectify, but they are also, stretched. So it did hamper, and of course it does pose big challenges. 10 years later, I don't think that problem's gone away. Well, we know it hasn't gone away from the research. I think there have been improvements, and some trusts are on top of it far more than others. So it's not. I think this idea of having a care record that's going to have all of that pertinent information in, and I know that when the clinician logs in, there's disclaimers on there, and you're meant to double, triple check with the patient, check, but we have to design something as well that is going to save clinicians time. If it's just going to create a load of work for them to go away and start to doubt, we've got another set of problems. So it is something that it will be overcome, and I think some of the new technologies, including AI, got to get that in, haven't I? Will help with that data cleansing process. So I think machine learning and those technologies have great potential, and I think there's some work already going on to support that around cleansing the data to expedite that process. And you've got to even if you're going to create models anyway using AI, then you have to you've got to ensure that your training data is
clean,
reduced bias, and make sure it's clean and so on. Absolutely. So maybe it can be done in tandem. Maybe each of that will create sort of the benefit, and the workload can be maybe it will expedite it, because it is something that needs to be done, of course.
So interesting, Paul, you talking about sort of data cleansing, that whole interoperability piece, because I think it's really, well, for me, it's absolutely integral to everything we do, and especially like coming on to sort of like talk about clinical risk management, whole data integrity piece, because information and the data is absolutely key to everything that we do in relation to sort of like patient management. And I give you an example, back in the day when I worked for IMS Maxims, and the whole pitch when I started for the company was in relation to, look at our application and look at the information it can hold, or what you can enter into the application, which if you look back at that is really crazy, because it's all about sort of like mobilizing that data and making sure that it's sort of like available, but in a manner that's going to assist clinicians in the work that we do, not just, here's an application that has stuff in it, in that sort of manner. And I think that leads sort of like quite nicely onto that whole importance of visualizing that data and making sure that the data is correct, and dirty data, like you say, appropriate data. Because from a clinical risk management perspective, obviously we know sort of like that if there's flawed, manipulated data, corrupted data, or missing data in relation to that, then it has a massive knock-on effect in relation to to what we do in relation to that. I don't know what your views are.
Yeah, so there's a very good document that is published by the Safety Critical Systems Club on data, and it goes through the whole spectrum of risks associated with data, from availability, integrity, and ensuring that data is up to date and available at the point of care.
So that's interesting you saying that. Sorry, and I don't want to interrupt, but what we'll do, Safety Critical Systems, we'll make that available on the podcast. We'll put a link on that. Just picking up on it, and that's absolutely fantastic. Sorry.
No, it's a free resource. There are a number of resources on there, and you can join the club to get additional resource, but there's a lot of good material that is available free of charge. So, you know, with health IT software, and much of what that relates to is around information flow, and that socio-technical complexity of clinical risk management involving that data, which we hope is correct and available to enable those care processes to be carried out safely and effectively. And whether that's, you know, data held in the EPR, or whether it's one of the programs I work on, which is NHS.Net Connect, formerly NHS Mail, where it links nicely actually with that interoperability discussion, because interoperability is not mature. Even something like NHS Net Connect is critical. You know, we've got 1.8 million users on the platform, thousands and thousands of organizations, user accounts, shared mailboxes, application accounts. It supports a variety of information flows, but equally that introduces additional risks that when you don't have that interoperability and information can be retained in a mailbox as opposed to making its way to the patient care record. So there's lots of considerations with the clinical risk management involving data from, you know, storage, security, and you know, that integrity at the storage level, and also within the actual care record, you know, from the moment that sender to recipient journey.
And it's really interesting you talking about that, because there'll be lots of people out there that are very much focused as sort of like looking at clinical risk management, looking at as a CSO in relation to clinical systems. And we sometimes you get, and I know I've done it previously, is that you can get quite blinkered in relation to, you know, you talk about NHS Mail. Back in the day when I sort of first started, I wouldn't even consider sort of like looking at NHS Mail or anything like that. And I know myself and yourself and Clive Tomset as well, we did a piece on and supported a piece on middleware in relation to sort of, and the whole sort of like, what is middleware, clinical risk management. And I still get asked sort of like to this day, and sort of like, you know, produce that nice sort of slide set, and yeah, can make that available to the audience as well if they need it, because I think it's really good. And
yeah, welcome.
I think it's really important, isn't it, as well, that we factor in all of these things, because lots of times, and like, you know, you'll see hazard logs and you'll see clinical risk assessments that are completed that don't consider, you know, some of these sort of like third party systems, etc., and stuff like that. And I think the whole third party piece, integration is absolutely key, isn't it, to that whole risk management process.
Yeah, I think it's right to say that when people think of clinical systems, they think of their EPR, and, you know, specific use cases for, you know, perhaps ambient voice, or even at the modular level, prescribing systems, order comms, and so on. Wouldn't necessarily think of NHS Net Connect, but it, you know, it is, you know, with user base of, like I say, 1.8 million, and probably at least half of those clinicians, and a lot of clinical information flowing on that system, without necessarily any defined use case. So we all know what prescribing does. We know that prescribing and meds management, and when you're undertaking clinical risk management for those workflows, you can define those use cases quite well, and you can work through the process. With NHS Mail, it's just easier to say that than NHS.Net Connect. It's not so clear, and again, another component of that is the IG risk that sits behind that, and the security risk. And I know that there's some CSOs don't necessarily include IG in security in that clinical risk assessment, but, you know, so much of it is related to the security of that information, that sensitive information that flows on the network, and the IG concerns as well. So if there are potential harms that could result from that sensitive data being accessed maliciously or through sloppiness around how that's handled by the end user, then those are safety risks that we would capture, along with all the other stuff as well, of course.
And I'm in complete agreement with you. And I think it's an interesting point, and it'd be good to get your view, because as we know, we've got the sort of DCB 0129 and 160 consultation is commencing this year. We've got the focus groups coming up next month. And, you know, you mentioned about information and cybersecurity, and, you know, whether, you know, the audience out there know who Dr. Saif Arbed is or not. He's an SME at a global level in sort of information cybersecurity, and he's really sort of like, you know, trying to communicate and push the point that we need to pay more attention to, you know, what we're doing in relation to information and cybersecurity. That whole supply chain is a risk. You know, health organisations may think they've got it sussed or their internal processes are robust. However, that's just one part of it, isn't it, in relation to that? And you have to make sure, like me saying about that third-party integration, and sort of like, you know, and making sure you're looking at that. And do you feel that's something, because if you look at the standards at the moment, you know, and I think sort of like, memory serves me right, you know, there's a little paragraph in there that says, you know, information and cybersecurity is not sort of like, you know, related to like clinical risk. I know they say, however, we need to sort of like that, but that's it. It's not sort of like, you know, they don't. There's no attention paid to it within the standards, and I feel we're in a, haven't we? With WannaCry, with the Synovis incident, and you know, now in the news, aren't they? They're saying that there's potentially like related deaths to the Synovis. Directly related to the Synovis issue, which I think is shocking, isn't it? Really, in that fact that can happen. So do you feel we should be paying more attention, and that the standard should highlight more and give more sort of either guidance or recommendation to what we should be doing?
I think it's definitely going to form part of that consultation. You know, historically, you know, the standards, you know, their focus is on regulated software, but with the increasing use of software as a medical device in the healthcare environment, those standards do need to be, and often that, you know, hosted off generic software platforms and general software platforms, and there is certainly increasing focus on cyber risk and also IG, and I think the standards will need to reflect that.
Yeah.
So these are areas which are well understood within the medical device space. They're you know, they form part of the ISO 14971 risk management standard. And if you look at the ISO 24971, the guidance document, there's a lot of helpful information in there in relation to cyber and IG, which can be used even for health IT software. You know, but that integration with software as a medical device is increasing, and this goes back to the role of the CSO and the work that's been done on the revised job description, or you know, that's been lacking for some time now.
Yeah.
And there's going to be, there is, you know, it's not that we necessarily have to be cyber experts, and we don't necessarily need to be IG experts either, but I think the CSO role does need to have a reasonable understanding and a good relationship with their colleagues who specialize in those areas. At Accenture, I work closely with the cybersecurity SMEs, with the IG SMEs,
Okay.
I've got a good knowledge myself, and that's one of the benefits of having that relationship, is that you get that knowledge transfer, and hopefully I'm upskilling them as well in the clinical risk management of software as a medical device. So it's working as that broader team. It's not that the CSO has to know everything, but they certainly need to have an understanding of the core risks, and then engage appropriately to ensure that you've got a comprehensive safety assessment. And when we talk about information and the need to access information at the point of care, and with cyber being obviously a significant risk, that could prevent that, or even if you can't access it, if that data has been tampered with, that can introduce other risks. Then it has to form part of any clinical risk assessment. So I tend to, in my practice, I've done certifications in 14971 and the 13485 and the software development lifecycle standards. I've put the effort in, and I've done risk management of AI in that. It's to develop myself and to have that knowledge. It makes my job easier, and it ensures I could do my job better. So I do place a strong emphasis on that, and ensure that I can deliver the best assessment possible for my organization.
And I think that's really key, and sort of like, a message to sort of like those CSOs out there that are looking to sort of, extend their roles, or are thinking, what should I do next? What do I need to do? I know you're a big advocate of sort of, that whole sort of like, not just knowledge transfer, but like is upskilling in relation to that. And I think the ISO space is really sort of is one that people should look at. Like you mentioned, 14971, 62304. And for anyone listening, I've scribbled some notes down, and I will sort of like put these into the introduction, and I can put some links in now in relation to some of these standards. But I think where it becomes more difficult, though, Paul, is that, I mean, that's fine for the likes of myself, yourself, that this is it's our full-time roles. It's what we do. It's the main concentration of our work, clinical risk management. And then if you dilute that down to like sort of, you got startup, and you mentioned about the importance of team, and it's one of the things I sort of like, I'm really passionate about. I mean, you only have to look at the strap line for DPM, it's safety in numbers. So, and that's what it's all about. But that then becomes really difficult for startups, and also for potentially sort of health organisations that are those smaller organisations. Yes, they have IT departments, but are people sort of, cognizant of, aware of the impact of, IT, etc., on those? And I think it becomes more difficult, doesn't it? If especially like coming back to that stuff, the startup, a two-man band, and all of a sudden the expectation is to know everything, and therein lies a risk in relation to that.
There's a lot of good information though on the NHS England developer website. You can certainly get up to speed with the standards, the requirements, and there's some implementation guides on there as well. I think the challenges with the standards, and also whenever you discuss regulation, is it's not quite as sexy as the innovating. And in that entrepreneurial space, we need to embrace the innovators to actually bring clinical risk management into the process as early as possible. And my advice to those innovators would be to at least get familiar with the standards and medical device regulation. By no means need to be the experts, but they should at least have an understanding of what they are, purpose, and the application of, and where to seek assistance. I think a lot of SMEs are sometimes afraid to reach out because seeking that type of advice can be perceived as being very expensive, and that can be the case. But I know yourself, and I also provide mentorship and advice in that space. Sometimes it's just around clarification of some of the terminology, and obviously, if it's given advice on whether I stop short on giving advice on whether I think something would fall under the regulatory scope, because that is a whole different exercise that has there's potential liabilities around that. But if it's just helping my innovation colleagues understand and to sort of clear up some of the complexities, because it is a complex landscape, but actually it's the more you dive into it to understand and pick at it, it does become clearer. But certainly on the face of it, it is, and even for those of us that have been working in the regulatory space for some time, there's still a lot, and it's evolving all the time. But the way I look at it is, and again, some advice to the listeners, you're not looking to be an expert in necessarily in medical devices across the board. Your subspecialty is software as a medical device, and subcategory to that AI ML as a medical device, and just focus on those areas and have a start at the top level and just have a broad understanding of medical device legislation, standards that support it, and so on. And then drill down and focus on that software as a medical device, which is what we're concerned with. And it complements what we do in the unregulated space. There's so much. I know you're a big advocate of the quality management system, which you need for your medical device. But actually, we should have, and I know we have or supposedly should have the equivalent of a clinical risk management system. But I've seen clinical risk management systems on one side of A4. It just doesn't wash. There's what you should be looking to do, and what I have done at Accenture is I take our in-house methodology, which is called Accenture Delivery Methods, and we have made up of work products and roles and responsibilities and guidelines and so on for various aspects of that software delivery cycle and beyond, such as change management, release management, incident management, testing, and so on. And I ensure that clinical safety is embedded into those methods. So my clinical risk management system does have numerous procedures, and it is, for all intents and purposes, a QMS that I then integrate with the other methods at Accenture to ensure that the work streams that I work closely with understand what is expected in that work stream for what I need to deliver as a clinical safety function, so that we end up with smooth operations, and we don't end up with last minute challenges at clinical safety group to say that the process has not been adhered to as it should have been.
And it's setting those expectations, Paul, isn't it? And I think it's absolutely essential that we take that approach. Like you said, you've seen examples of clinical risk management systems where they're sort of like 1-2 pages, and it's sort of almost like, what is that? And I think it's first and foremost in those situations, it's potentially a lack of understanding. People aren't aware, people don't know what a quality management system is or the drivers behind it. And, a lot of the time, I think and like you said, going back to you saying about that whole advice and guidance, I think sometimes what people need, they just need steering in the right direction, or they need to, when you're explaining to them and saying that, you have a lot of these processes already, or this is what you are actually doing as an organization. However, you're just not articulating it in the right sort of like in the right manner. And a lot of times we can turn that around quite quickly and be quite sort of proactive in relation to sort of like bringing them up to speed. And I think, like you said, it's having those processes, like you say, release management, change control, incident management, even just overarching risk management as well. In relation
most organisations, perhaps not so much the SMEs, most organisations are familiar with the 9001 quality management standards. So the 13485 is you know, it's based off that. And if you look at the 13485, you've even got a mapping at the end of the document in the appendix.
In relation to 9000.
In relation, so that mindset is often already there, but it's just tailored to medical device software. So there's a lot of, and that's one of the reasons why I initially got into the looking further into the standards that support software as a medical device, because there's a lot of really useful information there. In fact, even with the DCB 129, I went back to the original, not standard, but you know, the technical document that was produced at the time. It never actually got approved, did it, by the ISO? But it had a lot of additional information, because the DCB standards have been, I know some people might think they're complicated, but they actually were distilled from 95 whatever pages down to about 70 odd. But actually there's a lot of information in the original specifications that's actually quite useful. So it depends how much you want to get into the detail. I'm a detail person, so I like to have a really good understanding, because it just makes my life easier and means I can do the best possible job.
So in your role, Paul, and sort of like, you know, working for sort of like, you know, in that corporate space, and we've spoken about clinical risk management system. What practical advice can you give to people in relation to sort of implementing a clinical risk management system? You know, if you've got someone in an organisation, you know, they've done CSO training, there's a big ask of them. You know, I for instance, I got a call the other day from someone saying, I've been asked by my line manager to produce a clinical risk management policy. Where do I start in respect to that?
Yeah, so it's the clinical risk management system, as I define it, is those procedures, processes, guidance, could be crib sheets, all that sort of stuff that helps you implement a safe and effective clinical risk management process. So I've got procedures for, you know, defining the clinical risk management process through incident management, change management, testing, and so on, and also policy from the top. But it's one thing to have that sat in a repository, whether you use Confluence or SharePoint, whatever, as a load of PDFs, and it's another challenge to, you know, bring that to life. And you know, within the medical device space, mentioned you have to maintain a QMS, and often that is just a paper QMS, more so now an eQMS. And we don't necessarily have those tools within, you know, for those working within, you know, the space that would be covered by the scope of DCB. But I do try to automate as much as possible. So there is some configuration you can do, for instance, within ServiceNow, so that when an incident comes in, it can be flagged by the help desk as, you know, a clinical risk, as you know, as detailed by the person raising it. Of course, you know, I would still look at all Sev 1s, Sev 2s, but if it's raised as a clinical risk, it would come directly to me. But just being able to have the fields within Snow to be able to undertake that assessment, triage, and so on, and likewise within DevOps or whatever application you use for your delivery, to ensure that you have the appropriate fields to mark certain test cases as, you know, safety test and requirements, and you know, then that follows through to being able to assess the defects and able to map those defects, trace those defects to the appropriate control. You should try and automate that as much as possible. So when I was working on, I was CSO with Jerry Bolger on the the COVID-19 contact tracing app, and also
That's right. Yeah.
risk manager for a period of time for the software as a medical device aspects of that. That's exactly what we did. We use Confluence and Jira. Well, we're using a number of tools, but Confluence and Jira, we automated quite a bit of that through their filtering to ensure that the test issue had to be appropriately categorized and flagged each test and defect and incidents and so on. But also that really helped to automate the production of the clinical safety case report. So it was sort of, we produced, I forget now, maybe 100 different iterations of that safety case report. Anybody that knows anything about the COVID app, it was a fast moving piece of work, continual policy changes, and then it had to be reflected in those in the safety case and the reports. So it is quite intense piece of work, but if you can automate it can streamline that process. So the filters that we had within the testing and within the incident management system, those flowed into the report, which was produced via Confluence immediately. And then, some of those defects would be addressed before the next report was published.
Yeah.
And because we'd be looking at them, throughout that period, and they may then automatically go into a different table within that report and so on. So we were right, and the report was in the background, and we were sort of adding to that report by working in those various other tools. And then the actual report itself, when we came to produce that on the day, it was tidied up really, but it did cut down on the workload quite a lot. And of course, the safety report was then added to the technical file because it was a class 1 device, so we maintain that in that technical file as well. So the timelines were strict, and so we needed that. We needed that to get it done so we could get the next release out the door. So my core advice is bring the risk management system to life. Yeah. It's important you have the policies and procedures, but don't just set them all up as PDFs and keep them there for an internal audit. Make sure that you, where possible, try and embed them in the systems that you have.
And I think there's some fantastic tools out there at the moment, like you said. And we're even seeing the use of sort of like Confluence and Jira within health organisations as well, because the manufacturers that they are supporting them use Jira and use Confluence, that some health organisations have been proactive and have picked those tools up because they see the use of them. And I'm a big advocate in that, because all that does is promote a quality management system from my perspective, and promote sort of like you say, the introduction of process, but process that works for the organisation, process that's going to be applied and implemented, like you said, and not just sat in a file somewhere and someone says, oh yeah, that process is in there and I looked at it a year ago. It's like, well, that's not an effective process. You need to start again.
I mean, some people even say that, for Confluence and you can't really use that as a QMS, but we did.
No, you totally can.
MHRA were happy with that. I think I
completely disagree, because Confluence is used. We use it, and all of our clients get a Confluence site set up by us. And for people out there, it's free for the first 10 users. I know it's diluted down functionality, and you don't have some of the administrative and some of the hooks with that free sort of like offering. But I would say to anyone out there, any organisations, go and use it, absolutely, because it's a great tool. It's got great structure, and you can structure your whole QMS in there. And we know auditors absolutely love it from a 13485 perspective, because you can give them access, and they can go in and they know where everything is. And I think most auditors within that space, within the ISO space, know Confluence.
Yeah, and in any way,
Think,
even within the 1, 3, 4, 5, as you know, you have to assure the tools that you use.
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
you're going to have to, the auditors are going to be looking at that anyway. So if there's issues around, I don't know, sake of argument, a free version of Confluence and
Yeah,
authentication
yeah,
access,
yeah.
you would have to be mindful of that. But you would have to demonstrate that you've
But
considered
that's,
that in it is. So
yeah, it's part of your
but
suits
certainly
and
as
all that
a
sort of
tool in
stuff. Yeah,
itself.
yeah,
And there's also within the Confluence marketplace, you can access a specific EQMS. These tools also exist
yeah,
within
yeah.
Confluence.
And we're also, interestingly, Paul, we're also seeing now, sort of like this year and the end of last year, there are clinical risk management tools that are being developed
Oh
by
yes,
by
yes, we've got
different
one. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
by different sort of organisations out there. And I've been waiting for this for a long time, and we're sort of, we're going to be using one of those, which will remain nameless. I'm not going to get into sort of like, this isn't a sort of marketing tool for any given system, but I think it's the way forward. I give it another, I think, 5 years, and we'll
Are you
see the
trying to
back.
say you'd rather not use Excel spreadsheets? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. In 5 years' time, I think we'll see the back end of Excel spreadsheets and Word documents in relation to, hazard logs, safety case reports, etc. Because I think what these tools do, it makes it more dynamic. It brings it to life. They are, if people do this right, which a lot of the people out there in their approach, they are, they will be interoperable with tools like, Confluence, Jira, DevOps, etc., and
Yeah,
stuff like that.
exactly. And that's
And
where
it
we
just
that's where we
and
when
that's
that
where we need to
happens,
be.
exactly.
That's where we need to be. So when you talk about a clinical risk management system, people will be saying, "What do you mean clinical risk management system? That's part of my quality management system," and it'll be it'll be completely collaborative and interoperable, and it'll just be a part of one system that sort of is the driver and chugs along and does what it needs to do. And that's my vision, sort of like in relation to that. And it'd be great to get to that point, because I think when we get to that point, I'll be retired, or heading in that direction.
Well,
Respect
again,
to that.
it goes back into the increasing use of regulated software. And I think what will happen is, and more CSOs are upskilling in that area, and more healthcare organizations are deploying software as a medical device. And so they're going to have to face this challenge, and they are going to have the right systems and automation in place to make it a process that is implementable and actionable within their finite resources. So yeah, it's I mean, talking about risk management tools, from not just supporting the implementation of the risk management process, but actually helping to undertake that risk analysis. At Accenture, we use Bowtie XP, which is an industry-leading risk management software used in various safety critical industries. And I came across it a few years ago. I was actually when I was working on the COVID app. And I was looking for a product, and found there are a number of Bowtie software applications out there. And Bowtie is a methodology that is advocated by NHSE. I'm sure most of the listeners will be familiar with it, but it uses the concept of top event, and you have your threats or causes to the left, and your controls, mitigations to the right. And it just helps. It's a visualization. Well, actually, it's far more than a visualization tool, but that's one of the big benefits, especially when you're undertaking a hazard assessment workshop, to help some with the stakeholders that might not be as close to the work that you're doing. You can bring it to life. So Accenture did purchase a license for the Bowtie XP software, and I use that across the various programs I work on, which are mainly my most of my work is for NHS England. And it's been a great tool. And the difference between using something, God, that sounds like a sales pitch. It's not, but you know, when you use a tool that really works, it's more than just a pretty diagram that you can knock up in Visio or PowerPoint or Draw.io even. But it is an application where you can you can integrate it with your clinical risk management system. So you can add your procedures and so on to your controls, and you know, it just helps to keep everything in one place, but also to be able to demonstrate more easily the robustness of the controls and mitigations that you've got in place.
So, and no, and that's great. And I know you're a big advocate of bow tie, and I know sort of like one of our colleagues, Jerry Bolger, is as well. And Jerry's been on the podcast.
I sold it to him, got him into it. He's now he's more addicted than myself even. He needs treatment.
He's a guru, isn't he? In relation to, and even helped me out on one of my courses the other week that he was a trainee on. So you know, we've covered a lot of things, and sort of like that clinical risk management perspective. We did mention the focus groups and the consultation, DCB 129, 160, and I'd like to sort of like, you know, have a chat about that for a bit. So we, you know, as we said previously, we both sit on the Clinical Safety Leadership Committee at BCS, and it would be great to think that we as a group have involvement in relation to input into that consultation. But just for everyone out there, Paul, and I don't want us to, what would you like to see change in relation to, or not necessarily change, Paul, sorry, putting you on the spot, but what would you like to see in addition, you know, an upgrade, modification to the standards in relation to what we've got now?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that with this point, I'm probably speaking for all the CSOs, whether you sit supply side or healthcare organization side, and that is around the, call it regulation, call it what you want, but at the moment the standards don't really have a backbone. Their legal requirement under the Health and Social Care Act as one of the mandated information standards, and despite the legal requirement, there is oversight for those systems that are connected to the NHS spine through the clinical safety group, which is, you know, that governance mechanism is managed by NHS England. But beyond that, there's nothing really apart from
it's the Wild West.
It is, and it's a shame really, because when you have discussions with people about, you know, whatever level or, you know, or whichever stakeholder around, let's call it patient safety, because that's ultimately what it's about. Yeah. People are very vested. You will not find anybody says, you know, that I don't think that's that important. Everybody will argue for patient safety, but there's something around that perception when you get when you end up, you know, discussing the, you know, the requirements around patient safety for digital systems and the standards that need to be adhered to. It tends to people tend to either glaze over or just see it as a blocker. So we need to change that mindset whereby design and delivering, deploying safe systems, safe clinical systems is something that the suppliers should be fully focused on and not shy away from, regardless of the effort and investment that needs to be made. Because whether you're going to be chastise or not, it is it should be something that, you know, good practice and ethical organizations do and embrace. We do have some good mechanisms in place at the moment. The fact, you know, I know there's a debate over the effectiveness of DTAC, but, you know, within those procurement frameworks, it is in there. You know, much of the you know, the tenders that I'm involved in will ask for safety officer. You know, that the safety assessment and process needs to be followed. And you know, so that does make suppliers sit up. They thankfully, you know, at Accenture, you know, I am impressed, you know, since day one. I mean, we go back a long way. We go back to, you know, national program, you know, the inception of the standard. So we, you know, that we're quite mature when it comes to clinical safety. So that culture is, you know, it is strong. And I sit on the extended exec committee within UK Health. I've got a seat at the table, so I'm there as the you know, as the clinical representative, and I've got my eyes and ears all over UK Health, the systems that we develop or involved in. So I don't have to have that fight, but I do appreciate that many CSOs do, and I think if there was more oversight, you know, and I'm not saying that CSE and sorry, NHSE want to get in necessarily involved in that regulatory oversight, but something needs to fill that gap, whether it's the CQC. Well, the CQC has been, you know, there are requirements in there for around patient safety.
There
so
are.
might...
There are. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you know, you say NHS England don't necessarily want to get involved in that regulatory piece. Well, you know, they were the spark that started that fire, and it's burning. They created the standards. They mandated them under the Health and Social Care Act. Yet they say we don't want to regulate them. However, they're mandated. You know, there's a big call sort of at the end of last year since I think what it was, there was, you know, DTAC came out. You can see the sort of history of it. People were a bit unsure about DTAC. I think it's been a great thing because it's put clinical risk management and regulatory compliance, it's pushed it forward and it's put it out in the open. I think that's the good thing. That's the positive from DTAC. And clinical risk management, I think NHS England had they had to do something in relation to 129 and 160 because everyone started saying we've got this date of 2018 on there. What's happening? More and more people were asking questions, so hence we've got the consultations. But you can't then sit and they can't expect people to come to these focus groups and not want answers in relation to the whole how's it going to be regulated, because it's the missing link, you know. And I keep banging on about this, and I know people go, oh Dean, it's like boring, but MHRA, ICO, National Cyber Centre, they all have penalties and big penalties in relation to their work streams. And you know, why are we not seeing that in relation to clinical risk management, DCB 0129, etc.? Because you know, manufacturers can just sit there and sort of, you know, we see a varied landscape. You know, you've got manufacturers that are bullies in relation to these standards. You've got manufacturers that take that and said, well, those health organisations took it and it was fine. Why are you being a blocker, etc.? And then you also see it from the health organisation to manufacturers that are a bit green, startups. So we're really in a place at the moment where we need some direction, because I think it's really difficult for health organisations and manufacturers alike, because there's no real direction. And I really hope the focus groups give us that, but I'm very skeptical.
I don't think that has to necessarily be overcomplicated. Look, let's be honest. NHSE do not have the resources. They don't have the resources, but
it has to happen, Paul, doesn't it?
It has to happen. And so, if we look at what happens in the medical device space, okay, you've got the UK approved bodies for Class 2A and above, and you have to maintain a QMS, and that could be subject to, you have to go for that internal audit process, and external audit, and it is, you have to be subject to those inspections at regular intervals, and if you're not conforming, then you potentially withdrawn your software product, whatever, off the market. And we could mimic that to we could use that model that we have. Suppliers are subject to audit, and it doesn't have to be a direct replica of what exists within that medical device space, but you could use that model at least, whereby that NHSE, sit at the top of that governance tree, like MHRA. I mean, those audits are undertaken by a defined number of companies. It's just something that has to be procured. Organizations themselves, of course, if they have the skill set, can subject themselves to an internal audit, and then you could get an independent audit to follow. So there is that, for me, what would seem fairly obvious mechanism. And then, if you pass the audit, NHSE are made aware of that, and there can be a register, and having an audit is actually, I know it's pretty scary for if you've ever been through one, but actually you can learn a hell of a lot, and you can improve your processes and way of doing things, and it is I see it as a good thing and certainly if you have that independent layer of out there that is going to be looking at your work and ensuring that you've got the right procedures and quality at a certain baseline in place, then you are going to pay more attention. I think that's what we need. You can enhance the training, you can upskill, but you potentially will end up with a lot of passionate CSOs that want to do the right thing, but unless you have the organization behind you, and the resources behind you, and the top management support, it's going to be a struggle.
You're absolutely right, and it's a key point there. If you don't have buy-in, you don't have the support of top management, and if you don't have the awareness of top management around what it is and what you're trying to achieve, how that affects them, roles and responsibilities, and that, I think that leads me on to I just want to finish on, with all of this that we've discussed, where do you see the future of the role of a clinical safety officer in, say, look at sort of now, and we have the consultation, we have these wonderful new standards that support us in a way that we want them to. How do you see the role of the CSO changing in relation to that, or do you see it changing?
I think there'll be far more focus on the upskilling towards being able to risk assess software as a medical device. We're not just going to stay in the unregulated space. That software as a medical device is often integrated at the modular level, perhaps into unregulated software, such as specific modules within the EPR, and there will be that will increase, and there is going to, perhaps when that happens, actually it will become less of an issue for the CSOs to get that backing, because you are not going to be able to deploy a regulated piece of software in your organization unless you're doing the right thing. You will get found out very quickly. So the CSO, I think for those that want to, and some won't, there is a steep learning curve, but it is, I think that's the direction of travel, that you've got the two standards. There is, I mean, there has been an argument, shall we focus, should we just have an ISO 14971? And we could have an annex to that. I know that doesn't include the requirement for CSO. You don't necessarily have to, you share your clinical safety case. Having said that, there is more of an impetus now on manufacturers for software as a medical device producing an insurance case, which hasn't always been the case by any stretch. So there is potentially an argument for that, but it's not as straightforward, because ISO 14971 are very explicit about how hazard should be expressed. Focuses on hazardous situation, for instance, whereas in the DCB it's on, about the cause, effect, hazard, harm. Within ISO 14971, you've got hazardous situation. Yeah, there can be multiple harms to a hazardous situation. You can have each of those harms can be assessed at a different level of risk, and you have to assess every harm for each hazardous situation. It's there can be multiple hazardous situations for a particular hazard. So it's if people think the DCB are overly complicated, then have a look at ISO 14971. The fact that the focus is on there's another one, probability as opposed to likelihood. It's not easy to quantify some of the risks around software as a medical device and software risks, and it's complicated stuff. There's guidance out there how to do it, but it's still a challenge for those that are well seasoned in that area. So we've got to be careful what we wish for in the short term. But going back to this increase in use of software as a medical device, do we necessarily want to be using different methodologies? It may end up causing confusion in within the organization. So there's a discussion to be had, and yeah, it's a lot of skilling up to do, I'd say.
And it's interesting, isn't it? We'll see what happens over the next. I think the next 12 to 18 months is going to be really interesting in the regulatory space. There's lots happening. Whether it's the alignment with EU MDR for sort of medical device, for software as medical device, which will make everything Class 2A. That's happening at the end of this year. The DCB 129/160 consultation, and also DTAC, the working group, and that's planned to be. So there's a lot happening, which I know is going to keep both of us very busy, Paul, in our roles. Paul, I'd like to thank you for joining us on episode 21. It's been absolutely fantastic chatting to you. Before you go, I do this with all of my guests, is just to put you on the spot one last time, just to ask you if there was, just for the audience, if there's, on what we've discussed over the period of 2 days, just to explain to everyone that this episode has been recorded in 2 parts. What would be your one takeaway for everyone? The message that you'll give?
Don't be scared. I don't be put off, and this is for the SMEs out there, the innovators. Don't be put off by clinical safety. Don't be put off by those regulatory discussions that you will need to have. It's much better to have that involvement from the outset, because you need to formulate that regulatory strategy as well if you are developing software as a medical device and within the DCB space. If you want a product that can be released into the NHS that could potentially cause patient harm, then you need to abide by those standards. But I would see it as a positive thing. See it as something that,
Embrace
don't,
it.
and embrace it and be proud of it, that you're developing safe products. And see it as a real positive thing, and certainly don't see it as a blocker, because that's sometimes how it is perceived. I'm a pragmatist, okay? I'm not about putting up barriers. So it's, we need innovative products on the market, certainly the state of the NHS as we see it today. So we certainly don't want to be holding those products back. So yeah, it's walking hand in hand and doing the right thing.
Absolutely, and that's a great message to finish on. Paul, thank you ever so much for your time. It's been absolutely fantastic. And for everyone out there, thank you for listening or watching, whatever you're doing. Again, just a reminder, you can find us on YouTube and Spotify. And we look forward to Women in Health Tech Month, which is coming up on The Only Way is Ethics. We've got 4 panels with some fantastic people on. So for everyone, this will be the last episode of The Only Way is Ethics before those panels. Thanks again, Paul, and thank you to everyone for listening.
Thanks, Dean. Thanks, everyone.